I often think about the incredible diversity of individual tastes. One person loves vanilla ice cream, another hates it. Fred's dream car is a Mustang, while Roger prays to the heavens above that someday he'll own a BMW. Just about everything in life is a matter of taste, and chess is no different. One player likes his chess on the razor's edge, risking everything by sacrificing all his pieces in the name of the great god attack. Another player strives for security, quietly building up a spatial advantage and creating tiny holes in the enemy pawn structure. And both will look at the other guy and think, what's wrong with him? Who would want to play like that when you can do what I do? However, some things really are a matter of taste, while at other times taste is nothing more than not being aware of your options. A friend of mine, Yasser Seirawan, Yaz for short, who at that time was one of the world's top players, met an 18-year-old chess powerhouse named Garry Kasparov in Bigojno, Yugoslavia. Kasparov, who became the 13th world chess champion a few years later, was only just starting to step out of the Soviet Union with any regularity, and they decided to go to a movie together. Waiting for the film to start, Kasparov began unwrapping a Russian chocolate bar, and Yaz said, "Garry, why are you going to eat that?" Kasparov replied, "Why? Because it's delicious. Russian chocolate is the best in the world." Yaz unwrapped his Swiss chocolate bar, broke a piece off and handed it to the future world champion. Garry took a bite, then he paused for a moment and took another bite. Then he looked sadly at his Russian bar for a few moments and then tossed it on the ground and insisted that Seirawan share the Swiss chocolate. I bring this up because many chess players who think attack and tactics are the end-all and be-all aren't embracing that kind of chess due to taste, but simply because they don't know any better. In other words, as I said earlier, they aren't aware of their options. Of course, everyone in chess prefers different openings and different styles, but strong players or weaker players that want to improve and be the best they can be understand that success in chess calls for universal knowledge, or at the very least, a certain degree of balance. Yes, everyone needs to know how to attack, and everyone also needs to know tactical and mating patterns. But if that's all you know, if you're a one-trick pony, you'll eventually find yourself at a dead end. To make progress, you also need to know positional concepts, how to create weaknesses in the enemy camp, and be able to make use of that knowledge when your preference, we'll say a kingside attack, clearly isn't in the cards. In this lecture, we'll be studying the eternal battle between statics, which encompasses positional advantage like space and creating enemy targets, and dynamics, which encompasses attack, tactics, sacrifices, aggressive maneuvers, or simply active pieces. Statics are long-lasting things that you can slowly massage in the hope that they will become more and more problematic for the opponent as the game progresses. While some forms of dynamics remind me of poker's all-in play, where you bet everything you have on that one hand. Fortunately, chess isn't poker, and many dynamic advantages morph into a longer-lasting static plus, while the same can happen to a static advantage, in that all those positional gains can, in the blink of an eye, turn into an overwhelming mating attack. And that's why you need to be acquainted with both. They complement each other. You'll never be a great attacking player if you don't make use of statics when they're needed. Nor will your positional skills help you if you're unable to attack or make use of tactics when the time is ripe. There are a few different types of static versus dynamic scenarios. The first one we'll look at is white enjoys a long-term static domination, while black has neither statics nor dynamics to fall back on. In other words, one side has a clear plan, just takes time to milk. The other side really is purely passive. Anatoly Karpov is the 12th world chess champion, while his opponent was, in his prime, a world championship candidate. But it doesn't matter how strong you are if you don't have any tools to work with. White enjoys two long-term advantages: a central queenside space advantage and a far superior minor piece. What does black have? Nothing, since any attempt to gain kingside space by f5 will lead to the opening of that sector, thus leaving black's king in serious danger. So all black can do is wait and hope white doesn't come up with a way to break through into his position. Unfortunately for Yusupov, Karpov's handling of this kind of position is legendary. White's plan is the following. Ultimately, he intends to crack open the king's side with a g4 move or an f4 move. However, since black doesn't want to open that side due to king's safety, white will take his time, place all his pieces on their ideal squares, and only initiate the decisive attack when he's good and ready to do so. Knight a7. The knight, which is far more flexible in close positions, heads for c6, where it will be closer to black's king and will also place pressure against e5 in the event that white eventually plays his pawn to f4. Black just leaps into white's position, really doesn't accomplish much, but he doesn't have anything to do. Queen c2. This is actually a little trap. If black plays f5, rook to h2 traps the queen and wins it. Of course, a player like Yusupov would just laugh at the thought and would never do that. So he plays rook e8, knight c6, bishop f6. Once again, black's moves just back and forth, waiting to see if Karpov can come up with something. And Karpov, just incredibly patient. In fact, Karpov is a master of cat and mouse. Cat and mouse is a strategy that's very much like the classic rodent versus feline battle. Black, the rodent, is helpless against the cat, and the cat in this case is white, which kicks its victim about so that it tires. And when black ultimately sees that his fate is sealed, emotional capitulation follows. Another way to describe white's strategy is this. When your opponent is helpless in the face of your static might, do not rush. Take your time, create a perfect setup of all your pieces and pawns, and only then go for the kill. Queen d7, queen e2, rook h, f8, rook h2, rook h8, queen f2, rook e f8, rook f1, king g8. Now, as you can see, black is just pittering about, and Karpov took as much time as possible. And what that does is it kind of puts you on edge because you don't know when your opponent's going to strike. You know you can't do anything. So when is this guy going to do something that will allow you to then, come up with a defensive plan and maybe just end the misery and get a draw or whatever? Instead, he just makes it linger, and it weakens you when this happens. Finally, Karpov lashes out and plays f4. The guy leaps into g4, and Karpov offers a trade of queens. A lot of people would have kept those queens, but Karpov understood that black's only piece is the queen. And so the exchange of it leaves black as a complete bystander. Queen f3, rook e8, queen takes, pawn takes, and now white continues gaining space. f5. Black doesn't want to open this f-file, so he pushes the pawn to keep that rook on f1 blocked by its own pawn. And now white does something quite interesting. He pushes his pawn to h5. One would think that maybe this pawn could be lost or there's no open file, so how in the world is white going to make progress? But Karpov has everything in hand. Rook a8. Now the king comes up. With the queens gone, you can use your king. Everybody has to participate when an endgame arrives. Rook a6, rook a1, king g7, king c3, rook h a8, and b4. So what's happened is white kind of fixed things on the king side, and now the only side that can be opened is the queen side. And so that's what white's doing. He's trying to open lines on the queen side, and if he can manage to open the b file, he can bring his rooks to the b file and eventually penetrate down it. Once again, Karpov is taking his time, bringing his king up. Everybody has to be in perfect position. Black went king f8, and Karpov does a strange thing. You would think that he's going to open the line, but instead he closes things with b5, rook 6, a7. And now Karpov can always win this material. He's won an exchange, but the problem is if you win the exchange, if everything's closed, you're not going to be able to break through. And so you have to be very careful here. And so Karpov quickly pushes this, so the king can't block this pawn. And this allows him to have some potential penetration points on the king side. Bishop h8, and now Karpov gives away a pawn, f6. He gives away a pawn with f6 so that the f file is open, giving the rooks even more penetration points. He takes it, bishop takes f6, rook f1. Of course, the bishop retreats, and now we take the rook. And rook h5. So there goes the g5 pawn, and now the writing's on the wall, and it's all fallen apart for poor Yusupov. It's just a matter of the final penetration into the enemy position, and this f7 pawn gives him a square to penetrate. f6, rook g8, and he's still trying to hold on. And now we have a beautiful way to finish it. Remember, it's all about finding a way to penetrate, and that includes the king. This is an endgame. You need to get your king in the game. And so he plays another pawn sack, c5. All right, c5 is really a surprising move. It just gives away another pawn. But don't forget that the whole idea is that he's trying to get his king into the game. And by sacrificing these pawns, he's eventually going to be able to burst into the enemy position with his king, which will finish the game. So black has to take it. So he does. He takes the pawn, and white brings his king a little closer. Black is having trouble finding moves here. He can't take the rook because then white would make a new queen. And if he moves his king away, he'll lose the rook. And so he just goes here to kind of force something with these rooks. And Karpov now gives away yet another pawn. But by doing so, after it's captured, he's opened up the d5 square, which now allows the king to decisively penetrate. And in this position, white captured and black gave up. The reason is that after king takes f8, king d5, king e7, white's king is just coming in here and it's going to eat all these pawns and queen, all of them, and therefore the game's over. That was a long and admittedly advanced game. I don't expect you to understand every bit of it right now. Instead, I want you to look at this game multiple times to get a feel for the power of long-term statics. That's right, a feel. Much of chess is all about that magical feel. Not memorization, just a feel. When you look at a position that illustrates a concept many, many times, it somehow melts into your brain. And when that concept appears, or the possibility of creating that concept appears, you just know it. The Karpov game showed us how a player can quietly nurse a static, long-term advantage to victory. With that in mind, look at our next position and try to figure out what black should play. White has a massive space advantage on the queen side, and black needs to either find some sort of dynamic compensation or grab some space of his own in another area of the board. The move I'm hoping you spotted is e5. Claiming a central space advantage and also bringing his e8 rook into the battle, since you're opening a file. If white captures, then knight takes e5, activates the d7 knight. Also notice that white's c5 pawn, which was solidly defended by the d4 pawn a moment earlier, is now flapping in the wind with no defender in sight. So far, we've seen statics versus nothing, as in the Karpov game, and one static advantage versus a similar static plus in another area of the board, with both sides' pieces showing some dynamic potential. But what if one side didn't want to allow such niceties? What if he wanted to see a bit of blood on the board? There are actually quite a few ways to create such hyperdynamic situations, but the problem is that such things carry with them a great deal of risk. In fact, you might find that the blood on the board is yours. D4, D5, C4, E5. This is known as the Albin counter gambit. Black sacrifices a pawn to gain a little space in the middle, and it's not overly popular, but it's an interesting opening. Takes D4. And now you can see why he did it. This one pawn takes away the C3 square from White's knight and gives him that space. Usually White's the one that has more space, so it kind of turns the tables. E3. Not the best move in the world, but this is a very old game. Bishop B4 check, bishop D2, pawn takes pawn. At the very least, this leads to the weakening of White's pawn structure. Clearly, even in the midst of exciting gambit play, positional considerations are still important. Our next note highlights this important point. Queen A4 check was played, and this loses. For a moment, let's go back and see what he should have done. He should have played pawn takes pawn. Notice, of course, that he couldn't take with the bishop because the bishop's pinned to its king by the other bishop. After pawn takes pawn, if you look at the White's pawn structure, it's not particularly appealing. He has two isolated doubled pawns. So Black would be able to play something like Queen H4 check, G3, Queen E4, Queen F3, trade some stuff, and then Queen takes E5. And if you look at this position, Black has gotten his pawn back, and we now have a positional game. No more gambit stuff, it's a positional battle. But it's one in favor of Black, because White has this weak pawn on an open file. So eventually, Black's just going to develop his pieces, put his rooks on the E file, and just start beating on this weak pawn. Another important point is that after pawn takes pawn, you might think, well, wait a second, hold on. Why can't he just take the bishop? You just hung a bishop. But that's not really true. After pawn takes F2 check, you can't take the pawn because you'd lose the queen. So after this check, he has to move up here, which doesn't look overly enticing. And then Black plays a strange move. He takes the knight, but he makes a knight. That's our first instance of under promotion. He makes a knight instead of a queen. The reason he makes a knight is that it's check, and he wanted to get that check in. It's very important. Now, White isn't able to trade queens, which he'd like to do, because he's in check. So once the guy takes that knight, suddenly you can fork, or skewer in this case, his king and queen and win a queen. So yes, most of the time you make a queen, but there are tactical instances where you're going to under promote, and that was one of them. In this position here, White played Queen A4 check in the actual game. All right, so Black, of course, has to get out of check. He develops a piece, and White says, thanks, I've won a piece. Yeah, it's mine. However, not so simple. Black plays Queen H4. Now, of course, he's threatening to take at F2. But what is he going to do about this? The problem is that if he plays the most obvious defense, because since you're attacking this twice, why not just go G3? Black then plays pawn takes pawn check, king takes, Queen D4 check, And if he moves to this file here, you have queen e4 check, forking the king and rook, and you end up winning material. On the other hand, after the check, if he goes this way, you get to take this guy with check, and you pick up this rook. So all sorts of things are happening, none of them good for white. So queen h4 was played, and so white just developed a piece. Black comes in, gobbles that. King d1, and he keeps developing. Now, white's a piece ahead, but the problem is his king's in the middle, his pieces are pinned, black's queen is in his face, and black's about to castle queenside and bring that rook all the way down too. So white is just dead. It's not going to go well. So white develops. Best thing you can do here, he castles long with check. And at this point, he decides that he just has to give something back to close that file. This is just too painful, and he has to get out of there. And so he plays bishop to d6. Black takes it, and then he goes here to d6. Otherwise, black would take that pawn and open the file again, the d file again. So he pushes by so he can avoid the opening of the d file and maybe make the king a little bit safer. Black takes this, and white moves his king, getting out of this pin. So now this knight on e2 has the ability to move. And black does one last developing move. The knight now is ready to join in the attack. Once again, make sure all your pieces are in play. White lashes out, and now black starts final attack by pushing things open and trying to open those lines with the rook. White hits the knight. The knight takes up an aggressive post. And we have both knights in the center of the board, and white's king is still very, very open and probably won't survive. Queen c2, hoping the queen can kind of help out, but it makes it even worse. Knight b4. And he decides, you know, I'm about to get crushed because now the knights can come in here with check, the queen can come in here. And so he says, let's trade queens. I have a way to trade queens. And he actually checks the king by uncovering this line, and the knight attacks black's queen. So black takes the queen, white takes the queen, and black plays rook to d2. And suddenly there's still a mating attack. White plays knight e4, hitting the rook, and the game ends abruptly. Knight to d3 check. The king has to move here, and the other knight moves. Checkmate. It's clear that going for broke is lots of fun, though at the professional level, one seeks results and best play. If the game turns out to be fun, all the better. However, I think that amateurs should give gambits like this one a try, since it will help hone your tactical skills. But you also need positional understanding, since at any moment, the dynamics might fizzle and statics will rule the board. This game made the Albin counter gambit seem like a wrecking ball, and one might wonder why everyone isn't playing it, since Lasker was the one to tantalize you into seeing the Albin counter gambit in a very positive light. Let's let Lasker give you a dose of reality against Albin himself. d4, d5, c4, e5. Another Albin counter gambit. Lasker takes it, of course. d4, knight f3, attacking the pawn and guarding the pawn. Now Lasker plays a3. It's a useful move. It keeps the knight and the bishop out of the b4 and allows white to develop cleanly without any kind of nasty surprises on that square. Black plays bishop g4, and white plays h3. And they call that putting the question to the bishop. Are you going to take me, or are you going to run away? In this case, he took it. And Lasker took back towards the center, Black took his pawn back. And the question is, why did White allow his pawns to be doubled? What has he gained? Plus he got, he lost his pawn that the guy sacrificed in the beginning of the game. And what Lasker did was he's turning the game positional. And what he has is two bishops. And White has the two bishops, Black has a bishop and knight. And so White is going to now create a strategy where everything is about his bishops, making his bishops, especially the light-squared bishop, more powerful than anything Black has. And if he can do that, he's going to win the battle of the minor pieces and have a far superior position. So he's created a difference in the game, bishop versus knight, and he's going to milk it. And we'll see how it goes. F4, and what this does is it opens up this long diagonal here, aside from chasing the knight back. And now bishop g2, and you can see what he's been doing. Now this bishop, very powerful along this diagonal, much better than the knight. Another way of putting this is that White's extra pawn gave him a long-term static advantage. He traded that in for the acquisition of the light-squared bishop, which is a dynamic advantage thanks to its extraordinary activity. There's one other point to Lasker's play. The G file's open. Black probably won't want to castle queenside due to the light-squared bishop aiming in that direction. But kingside castling isn't a bed of roses either, since White's rook will eventually go to the G file and aim directly at the king side. Queen d7 and immediate b4. And now the bishop can go to b2 and put some pressure on this square here, this pawn on d4. But also by pushing that, it really scares Black on the queen side. Now he doesn't want to castle queenside. This pawn's going in that direction, the bishop's aimed in that direction, and so that's enough. He's not going there. So he plays a6, Lasker develops, the rook comes to d8 to guard the pawn some more. Now it's time to get the knight out. Once again, these guys always use every piece they have. Knight to b3. The knight's taking up an optimal position. If you look what it does, it threatens at any moment to leap into c5. And it also puts a lot of pressure on d4. So it does a couple jobs, so it's perfectly placed. And Black plays a pretty good move, knight f5. Frees this so that the bishop is able to move and also give some defense here. And in many positions, the knight can actually move on to h4 and hit the bishop. So both sides are playing pretty well. Queen d3 stops the pawn from advancing, guards c4, and takes an eye out for f5. Notice every move they make, they can explain why they made it. If you're going to make a move, you always should pretend that you have some trainer or somebody asking you, why did you play this? And if you don't have an answer to that, then why are you playing this move? You should reconsider. After queen d3, bishop e7, bishop to e4, kicking this knight. The knight retreats and hits the bishop. So after knight d6, White throws in knight c5, hitting the queen and also eyeing this b7 pawn. The queen retreats. Now White retains the bishop. Black castles, which he has to do. He can't leave his king in the center. And rook g1. And you can see White's dominating. The knight here at c5 is extremely strong. Black's knights aren't going anywhere. The bishops are very powerful. And this rook is eyeing Black's king. And it's all bad for Black. And of course, Lasker went on to win the game. In effect, again, in this game, Lasker traded in a long-term static advantage, the material, for dynamics, open G-file and monster light-squared bishop. The static versus dynamic battle is often an equal one, and the result isn't dependent on whether statics are better than dynamics or vice versa. The result is all about who plays better, who makes the best use of what they have. Here's a very well-known structure that is wholly devoted to the static versus dynamic battle. I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to put some serious thought into your reply. Ready? Here goes. Black wants to move his undeveloped b8 knight. Of the three possible knight moves, knight a6, knight c6, and knight bd7. Which one is correct and why? The why is very important, so make sure you have both the move and the why worked out. Good luck. Knight a6 has nothing to do with one of the major parts of the imbalance, c4. Keep in mind that white has doubled pawns, and the front pawn is always the most vulnerable. So everything you do has to have something to do with that. And knight a6 has nothing to do with it. You just stuck a knight out there, has no meaning. Therefore, we have to try another move. Knight on b to d7. That's a very useful move in many ways. However, it also has nothing to do with c4. It does help you in the center do various things like push your e-pawn, but it doesn't address this potential target on c4. And that only leaves us one other choice, knight c6. Why is this so good? The answer to that question, you need to listen to what the pawn structure is saying. Once again, we're going to talk about this weakness. White has a huge pawn center and a clear space advantage. To combat this, black needs to find a way to attack the center. Normally, pushes like pushing your pawn to c5 or e5, those things are great. But in this particular type of structure, that c4 pawn is vulnerable, and it's a major point of contention. And so by playing knight c6, you're able now at the right time to move your knight to a5, where it will then hit the c4 pawn. So let's have a look at how this works out. Knight c6, knight e2, bishop a6, hitting c4, castles, knight a5, hitting c4 again. Now black has two pieces attacking that square, and there's only one defender. And if white decides he's going to, try to guard it, queen a4, black will try to destroy the defender by queen d7 and say, let's trade. But if you do trade, you're going to lose the pawn anyway, because then you won't be able to defend it anymore. And if you move your queen, c5 hits it, chases it back, and once again, you've lost that pawn. Here's our final look at the battle between dynamics and statics. Here's our usual setup against the c4 pawn weakness. However, this time, white bails out, and instead of going for a kingside attack, he simply pushes his weak pawn out of danger. So, c5. He couldn't defend it, per the last game that we looked at, so he decides just to push it out of danger. Bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, and black hits the pawn again. And after c takes b6, black has a couple choices. He can take with the a pawn, opening that file, which is very good, or he can take the way he did, c takes b6. The point of this is it opens the c file so that the rook can go there and put pressure on this pawn. So after c takes, white castled, black put pressure on that file, and now there's going to be permanent pressure here, plus black also now dominates the c4 square. It's a great square for his knight, and black has an excellent position with the square, the pawn weakness, plenty to play for. And now the game boils down to whether or not white can generate enough dynamics to balance the statics versus dynamics equation. Here, I prefer the static advantages of black, but some might prefer white's dynamic potential and his central space, a static plus. With the battle lines drawn, it's anyone's game. And that's the whole point of static versus dynamic battles. It's a philosophical battle that can go either way.